hopefully I'll be a little shorter tonight. Well, maybe we can get through. I plan on going through chapters 4 and 5, and I'll do it as quickly as I can. But I really want to cover the high points of it, and then if we need to get out there and work on the nativity, we can do that. But we're in Ezekiel chapter 4, and we're looking at Ezekiel's call. Or we finished his call. The first 3 chapters is all about Ezekiel being called into ministry. God got his attention by the wheels and the 4 creatures, and so he got his attention. That's first thing. And then he said, "I've got this thing I need you to do." And now we're going to get to chapter 4, where it's actually the judgment oracles is where actually God is going to start putting some things into place that Israel needs to know. And if you remember, let me see if I can find the specific verse. In chapter 3, it talks about, look at verse 26, chapter 3, verse 26. "Moreover, God said, I'll make your tongue stick to the roof of your mouth so that you'll be mute and cannot be a man who rebukes them for their rebellious house. But when I speak to you, I'll open your mouth, and you'll say to them, Thus saith the Lord God." So he strikes Ezekiel mute, says you can't talk. And now when we get to chapter 4, he's still mute. So everything Ezekiel is going to do now is going to be pantomimed or acted out because he can't talk. He can't talk until God tells him to talk. Now, God's eventually going to let him open his mouth and talk again. But at first, there's going to be a series of dramatization. Like I told you last week, we call them pedagogian biographies. These real-life things that they do to prove a point, to show a spiritual truth. And so we get through those in chapter 4 and 5. Chapter 4 and 5 really... Actually, from chapter 4 all the way through chapter 7 kind of go together, but we're going to group 4 and 5 together for our purposes tonight. And the whole book of Ezekiel covers the time period of his prophecy. From about 593 BC, when he started his ministry, all the way down to 586 BC when Jerusalem fell. And so Ezekiel's prophecy, this whole book covers that whole time period. And when we get to chapter 4, God is going to give him some specific messages of doom. God's going to destroy them through captivity, even though the people thinks that he won't. And so Ezekiel's job is to come along and tell them that God will. You know, not only will he, but he's going to, and it's going to be soon. Chapter 4 and 5 is in 4 parts. The first part is he's going to talk about the fact of the siege that they're going to go through. He's going to use the Babylonians to come in and take Jerusalem captive. That's when Daniel is taken away. That's when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are taken away. And so these first 3 verses of chapter 4 is the fact that it's going to happen. This is what I'm going to do, says God. I'm going to go in and I'm going to take you. You're going to be under siege. Then when you get to chapter 4, verse 4, down through verse 8, God is going to use Ezekiel in these pantomime things that he acts out to show them the length of the siege. So he's going to take 3 verses and he's going to act something out to demonstrate the siege of Jerusalem. Then he's going to take these next 4 verses for our intents and purposes, 4 verses, and he's going to say this is how long it's going to last. But Ezekiel's not going to tell them because he's mute. God has stuck his tongue to the roof of his mouth, so to speak. So he's going to act it out. And by him acting it out, he's going to draw their attention to something they're very familiar with, and it's going to show them exactly how long this captivity is going to take place. Then the third section of all this is in verse 9 through verse 17. And he's going to tell them the severity of it. How bad is it going to be? First of all, God is going to send the Babylonians in, even though you guys think he's not. Second of all, this is how long it's going to last. Thirdly, this is how bad it's going to be. And then in chapter 5, the first 4 or 5 verses, he's going to talk about the results of this, what's going to happen because of it. So that's the way all of this plays out. Remember, he's got his attention, the wheels, the cherubim. Now we get to this first thing. And now, here's where Jerusalem went wrong, and here's where a lot of Christian people go wrong today. they have this thing that theologians call a Jerusalemite theology. And they think that because they're God's people, that they're the Israelites, they're the Hebrews, that they're untouchable. And they base it on four things. Ezekiel tells us about it, Ezekiel chapter 12. But the first thing is, they'll say, Yahweh made a covenant with us. God made a covenant. He said He'll always be our people. We'll be His, we'll be His people. He'll be our God. So God's made this covenant. So they will say, God's not going to erase us out of there. God's not going to do anything to hurt us because we're in a covenant with Him. God has established that. The second thing is that God made a commitment to the land. This is God's land. I mean, give it to you, and it's going to be yours. And so God made this covenant with land. So they say God's not going to do anything to endanger the land that is His. All right. Third thing is they say that Yahweh made a commitment to Jerusalem. God loves Jerusalem, and so God's going to take care of Jerusalem. And then the fourth thing is they'll say God made a covenant with David. And because God made these four allegiances, or these four covenants, they developed what we call this Jerusalemite theology, where they say God's never going to do anything happen to us. He's never going to do anything harsh to us. He's never going to judge us for anything because we're God's people. Now, translate that to the 21st century, and there's a lot of Christians that believe the same thing. God's going to let me do whatever I want to do. You know, I've got grace, so I can go live the way I want to live, and God's going to always show me grace, which is true to an extent, but that's a really sorry way to live your life. That's not what God's called us to do. So that's what Ezekiel's going to do in chapter 4 and 5, is he's going to bust up this theology that they have by showing them how God is going to judge them. And so what he did was, in chapter 4, verse 1, down through chapter 5, verse 4, he takes several symbolic acts, these acting things, dramatizations, and he's going to show them how the Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. All right, so that's the first thing he's going to do. It's a series of acts, and it's going to demonstrate to them that Jerusalem is going to fall. Then in chapter 5, verse 5, down through chapter 7, verse 26 or 27, there is a series of discourses. God lets him open his mouth, and now he couples what he acted out with what God wants him to say, and he paints this picture of how, because you guys were disobedient, God's going to judge you. All right, that's how this is going to play out. All right, so let's look at chapter 4, verse 1. Let's look at the first. Remember, his mouth is shut. He can't say anything. So these first prophecies that we're going to read about were delivered, not spoken. They're acted out. They're dramatization. They are what we'll call acted out parables. It's a story that tells a point. There's a point behind it, but it's acted out. It's not spoken. And to me, what it reminds me of, and I hate these guys really, but it reminds me of a mime on a street. You know, they're like stuck in a box kind of thing. That's what Ezekiel's going to do. He's going to have to act out these dramatizations of what God is going to do to Israel. So look at chapter 4, verse 1. And we'll read the first two verses. Now you, son of man, get yourself a brick, place it before you, and inscribe a city on it, Jerusalem. Then lay siege against it. Build a siege wall, raise up a ramp, pitch camps, and place battering rams against it all around. So what he first tells him to do is, and I hope you get this out of this passage, he says, I want you to build a model of Jerusalem. In this case, it's a brick. It's a brick that they would have built with. It is a sun-dried brick. The word that they use here is sun-dried, not kiln-fired. It's not heated in an oven. It's dried out in the sun. And it's a brick they would have built with. And he says, I want you to take this brick, and I want you to inscribe Jerusalem on it. And I want you to take this brick, and I want you to lay siege to it. In other words, you're going to act out the battle of Jerusalem. And look what he says in verse 2, because he gets very specific. And this is a huge deal that he does. He says, build siege walls, raise a ramp, build a ramp, siege ramp like that's at Masada, pitch camps and place battering rams against it. So he said, this is going to be very detailed on what I want you to do. He said, I want you to build this city. Now, he built this he built this model, and it's not, I don't think, just, like a little Lego set. This is a pretty involved model that he builds. He builds the city of Jerusalem. They all know what it. They hope it's going to be Babylon, and you see that from the text. They're thinking maybe this is going to be Babylon. He's going to show us how God's going to destroy the enemy, but it's not Babylon. It's Jerusalem, and he builds this city out of brick, and then around the city he puts camps of the enemy. He puts a siege wall there. He puts siege ramps, like the earth. When they laid siege, especially the Romans, but when they laid siege to a city, like the Romans did at Masada, if the tower was up high, they would just pile up the dirt till it built a ramp up to where they wanted to go. And so he built this model with this brick, and then he built this siege ramp that goes up to it, and all these kind of things. So it's a pretty elaborate deal that he's built. And it's a model. I mean, it's not just one brick. It's a model of the city. And so when they see the model of the city, it's going to be very distinctive. It's going to be very easily identified. There's nobody that's going to mistake it for what it is. That's why I say he's not speaking. He's not talking. He's just building. And as he's building, they're hoping that it's going to turn out different than what it is. Because all these people are watching him. He's like a street performer out there. So he builds this thing, and it's going to be, like I say, very noticeable. It's going to be everybody's going to know what he's doing. Then look at verse 3. God said, then get yourself an iron plate and set it up as an iron wall between you and the city, and set your face toward it so that it's under siege, and besiege it. This is a sign to the house of Israel. So he says, now I want you to take an iron plate and put the iron plate between you and the model of the city. You're on one side, the iron plate, and the city's on the other side. I want you to do that. And then he said, I want you to lay siege to the city. Just destroy what you just built. Lay siege to it. And he said, it's going to be a sign to those people. Now, he's not saying anything. Ezekiel's not saying, hey, this is you guys because of your sin and all this kind of stuff. He's just doing, and they're watching. So he builds this model of Jerusalem, and then they're like, hey, that's Jerusalem. That's pretty cool. He built a city. And he takes this iron plate and he puts it there, and he gets on the other side of it, and I think there's significance to that. And then God said, now destroy what you built. Destroy the city. And when he destroys the city, first of all, they're going to say, this was a prophet of God, so he is delivering to us God's message. And then when they see that he's destroying the city, the message is going to be pretty clear that our city is going to be under siege. We thought that we were untouchable. We thought that God would, let us escape the Babylonian armies. We thought that God may even turn the tables and destroy them. But Ezekiel is now showing them through this little act that God's going to judge Jerusalem. God's going to get you people. The iron plate, it's really hard to know exactly what it is. The Hebrew translation is a cooking griddle, like something they cook on. But evidently is pretty good side, And so God is going to show them now that they've drawn His wrath, and that they are basically His enemies. And so the iron plate is almost going to serve as like a barrier of sin between God and the people, and it's going to be torn down. So this is the first thing he's called to do. Builds this city, builds this model of Jerusalem, and then God said, okay, now put this separating wall between you and the city. So they're all watching. And then he said, now go destroy it. So they're watching this, and they say, okay, I think he's trying to tell us that we're in for it. And it's almost like Ezekiel represented them, and that iron plate kind of represented the sin in their life that had almost erected a barrier that prayers couldn't penetrate. And God is saying, now, you've kind of crossed the line, and judgment's coming. And so that's his that's the model. Remember, those first three verses is the fact of the seed. This is what's going to happen. God is going to destroy Jerusalem with Babylon. So that's what he's just pointed out to them. Now we're going to go to chapter 4, and he's going to tell them how long this is going to last. First of all, he says, you guys are going to get taken over. I mean, you're going to go into captivity. And now I'm going to tell you how long it's going to last. And remember, Ezekiel's just a guy we are, and I always think it'd be much easier to just say it than have to do what Ezekiel did, because it kind of gets a little more bizarre. But look at verse 4. As for you, this is God talking to Ezekiel, lie down on your left side and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel on it. You shall bear the iniquity for the number of days that you lie on it. For I have assigned you a number of days corresponding to the years of their iniquity, 390 days. Thus you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. So he says, okay, here's what I want you to do. Build this model of Jerusalem, put this iron plate between you and the city. Then I want you to go and destroy the model. Then he says, I want you to recline in public on your left side for 390 days. 390 days you lay on your left side. And God tells them why. That is the number of days that corresponds to the number of years that they'll be in captivity. She's going to be 390 years. And so I want you to lay 390 days. Evidently, the way this describes this, evidently when Ezekiel was laying on his left side, he faced north. He was facing towards the northern kingdom, which means that his body would have been facing west, facing towards the city of Jerusalem. All right, and so he's laying there for 390 days. Look at verse 6. When you've completed these 390 days, and let me say this. I'm going to try to show you from the text in just a minute. I don't think he laid there continuously for 390 days. I think it was just a couple hours a day. I don't think he laid there continuously for 390 days. But look at verse 6. When you have completed these 390, then you shall lie down a second time, but on your right side, and bear the iniquity of the house of Judah. I have assigned it to you for 40 days, a day for each year. So now, after the 390 days has expired, he's going to lie on his right side for an additional 40 days. That additional 40 days represents the additional years that the southern kingdom of Judah is going to have to suffer. So 390 days for the northern kingdom of Israel, 40 days for the southern kingdom of Judah. So if you add all those up, it's 430 days. So for 430 days, Ezekiel is going to be lying down and facing the city of Jerusalem and then facing the opposite way. And it is assigned to them of how long this is going to last. You're going to get invaded. Here's how long it's going to last. Remember, he's not saying anything. He's not telling them this. He's just demonstrating it. So for 430 days total, he's just laying there. And hopefully they're starting to get the picture that he's trying to tell us something here. You know, the city's destroyed. And now he's just laying here. And so now they got to piece it together. Now, here's where it gets kind of tricky, because the fact that those years represented the years of divine punishment are pretty clear. I mean, it's pretty clear from this that those years represent the years that God will judge them. The problem comes in, are they literal years or are they figurative years? Which one are they? Is it a literal 430 years, or is it just a symbol of a long span of time, or what's the deal with it, you know? Now, I think there's a lot of theories on this when you start reading theologians and scholastic journals and different things. I think that 430 years is the total time that they're going to suffer. I think it's a literal 430 years that God is trying to tell them. I think that when you look at Exodus chapter 12, verse 40, the Israelites were in captivity for 430 years before the Exodus got them out. And the total time of all this is 430 years. So I think by adding up the days, all these Israelites would have recognized from their history, that's how long we were in Egypt. That's how long God had us captive in Egypt. They would have known that. And so I think he's trying to make a point to them that this is a specific number. I'm giving you this number for a reason. And then he flips over for 40 days on his right side. Well, what does that symbolize? 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. They would have recognized that. And he's trying to draw these parallels to them to say that you guys are suffering like they did. Egypt got down in Egypt and got stuck in captivity and then kind of turned away from God. And when they marched out, they started backtracking on God and searching for idols and all these kind of things. 40 years they wandered in the wilderness on an 11-day journey. They had to go 11 days to cross over into the promised land, but they wandered around Moab for 40 years because of disobedience and unbelief. And now God is trying to say to these people, you guys are going to suffer that same 430 years because of the same problem. You just don't get it. You know, you hadn't learned anything. You still got unbelief. You still got disobedience, so you're going to suffer again. Except this time, Moses is not there to tell them. Ezekiel's there to show them. I'm showing you this. And so can you imagine what if God gave me a sermon for you one Sunday, but he said you can't use words? You just can't talk. You just have to come in here and act it out. And what if I came in here and I built a model of Rome? And I had the clock tower and all the landmark. And as I'm building it, you start to notice it. When I finish, you say, well, that's Rome. That's exactly what that is. I know what that is. And you say, Jeff, that's pretty cool. That's pretty good artistry. You know, I didn't know you had it in you kind of thing. And then I just kind of walk over there and start destroying it. And then I would walk out the door. Then you'd be thinking, okay, either number one, he's nuts. And he's just lost his mind. Or number two, was he trying to prove a point to us that maybe we need to think about it and see what he's doing? And then if I came in here the next day and just laid down on my side and didn't say anything. That's laid here for a couple hours. Then I went home. And you'd think, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of weird. And for them, he just lays there and he lays there every day. They're going through this little thing. And then some of these old guys that really know their Hebrew history, they say, he's getting real close to 430 years, guys. You know, I mean, 430 days. And you know, the last time we had 430, it was in Egypt. And so maybe there's something to all this. And so they start trying to piece it together, and God is getting the message across to them, even though Ezekiel's not saying a word. That's kind of what's happening to them. Now, look at verse 8. Look at verse 8. Well, first of all, look at verse 8. And here's where I'm going to try to prove my point to you. Now behold, this is God talking to Ezekiel, I will put ropes on you so that you cannot turn from one side to the other until you have completed the days of your siege. Now, I don't really think, I think, this is the way I interpret this. I think God promised to help Ezekiel by restraining his movements. I don't really think that the text warrants that God sent somebody in there every night to tie him down. I think God supernaturally helped him stay in place. I think that's a pretty logical reading of it, because the verbs and some grammatical stuff that's going on. But he says, I'm going to do this. I'm going to help you. Now, again, we're going to get to this starting in verse 9, but it appears that he only had to do it a couple hours a day. He just did it for show for a couple hours a day, and then for that, let's say 2 hours a day, 3 hours a day, God enabled him to lie there quietly. Now, he could have put ropes on him. I don't know. I don't think I think that the Hebrew rendering of this is not clear enough to suggest that that's the way it's got to be. But God enabled him. However, if he bound him down or if he just supernaturally put him in place, God allowed him to stay there. But I don't think it was all day long. And this is why. Well, let me say this first. God's servants, not just pastors, but God's servants, sometimes have to endure a lot of tedious, repetitious unpleasant, benign type stuff. You know, so sometimes as God's servant, it's not always the most exciting, glamorous thing you can do. Sometimes it's the monotonous. Sometimes it's the kind of quote unquote boring kind of stuff. Ezekiel, it's not very exciting. He just lays there. I mean, it's not very exciting stuff. It's kind of tedious work, but that's what he called him to do. Now look at verse 9, because again it gets even weirder. But as for you, God talking to Ezekiel, as for you, take wheat, barley, beans, lentil, millet, and spelt. Spelt's part of the wheat family. It's a cereal grain, but it's more nutritious than just average wheat that grows in a field. So he said, you take these ingredients, and you shall eat it according to the number of days that you lie on your side, 390 days. So now God this is the third. You know, first of all, with the fact of the siege, it's going to happen. That's 1 through 3. Now 4 through 8, how long is it going to be? 430 years. That's how long it's going to be. Now we get into how bad is it going to be? How bad is this Babylonian invasion going to be for us? And so he says in verse 9, take these ingredients, which by the way, you can go buy Ezekiel bread, and it's made of this exact same stuff. I've tried it. Wouldn't recommend it, as a dietary consistent thing, you don't want to eat it every day. I wouldn't want to eat all my PB&Js on Ezekiel bread, but if you want to try it, go to the store, you can buy some, and you can see kind of exactly what Ezekiel ate, except you don't cook it like this. All right, so he says you're going to eat this for 390 days. Look at verse 10. Your food, which you shall eat, shall be 20 shekels a day by weight, and you shall eat it from time to time. So he tells him exactly how much. That's 8 ounces. 8 ounces of bread a day. That's what he gets. Look at verse 11. The water you drink shall be the 6th part of a hin by measure. So the water that he gets is going to be about 1 1/3 pints of water a day. So about 1 1/3 pints of water, about 8 ounces of bread a day. That is that's a famine ration. That's when there's a famine in the land, is how much you get. You're to make it last. Why is God doing this to Ezekiel? Because he's trying to show the people that this is what you're going to have to survive on when the Babylonians come. When the city is laid siege and when you guys are overran, it's going to last for 430 years. And you guys are going to have to survive just like this. Ezekiel's not saying anything at this point. He's just acting it out. He's showing them through what he does. And so he's eating this little bit of bread, a little bit of water, and like, you're going to starve to death. And they don't know that God is trying to say to them, that's exactly how you're going to live. And that's exactly what you're going to have to go through. His bread is, look at it, 6 ingredients instead of just 1. Because he's showing them how people in a siege would have to survive. In other words, they would mix small amounts of whatever they could find to make the stuff they ate. And so that's what he's trying to show Ezekiel. He's trying to say, you're going to have to show them exactly how severe this is going to be. It's going to be bad. And they're going to basically have to just pile everything they get together they can find and make something to eat out of it. They're going to be scrounging and scraping and trying to get by the best they can. That's how bad this is going to be. Look at verse 12. You shall eat it as barley cake, having baked it in their sight over human dung. So he says, this is how you're going to eat it. You're going to eat it, you're going to bake it over the heat of human excrement. That's how you're going to bake it. And he says, look what he says. You're not going to just do it, you're going to do it in their sight. They're going to watch you do this. Because remember, he's trying to show them that the Jews under siege in Jerusalem, because of disobedience, not because God hates them, not because God's necessarily mad at them, because they're disobedient. God's trying to restore them to himself. He's saying, this is how you guys are going to have to survive, and I'm showing you how it's going to be. Now, if I'm Ezekiel, I'm thinking, can I have a better ministry assignment than this, let me just tell them. Don't let me do this, Let me just tell them what's going to happen. But that's his assignment. That's what they have to do. Now, Here's why I say he couldn't have been laying on his side continuously all day long, because he had to get up and bake bread every so often. So he's having to get up, he's having to bake bread. Then God allows him to lay down for a certain amount of time in one place to show them the length of the siege. And while he's going through this 430 days, God is showing him and them through him the severity of how bad it's going to be. You guys are going to be scrounging stuff together. You don't have a stove. You don't have a campfire. You're going to have to cook it over human dung like they are. And it's not going to be pleasant for you during all this time. You remember Daniel was snatched away from all this and taken to the palace in Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taken away from this and taken to the plains of Shinar in Babylon and lived a pretty decent life there. But the rest of those people left behind in Jerusalem, this is what they're going to go through. The city's going to be destroyed. I mean, it's laid waste to. They thought the temple would never go down. Jerusalem's walls will never fall. But those walls around Jerusalem have been torn down and rebuilt 39 different times. And it's because of their disobedience. Now look at verse 16. Moreover, he said to me, Son of man, behold, I'm going to break the staff of bread in Jerusalem, and they will eat bread by weight, and with anxiety, and drink water by measuring in heart, because bread and water will be scarce, and they will be appalled with one another and waste away in their iniquity. It's God's explanation of what Ezekiel's having to go through. You know, you're going to have to eat like this and do this because that's the way they're going to have to do it. You know, I'm just telling you. All right, so that's his. That's the fact of the siege. That's the length of it and the severity of it. Now we skip over to chapter 5, and he tells us in the first 4 verses, be all we get to, but the first 4 verses, he's going to tell us the results of it. What's the results of it? Again, it gets weirder. Look at verse 1. As for you, son of man, take a sharp sword, take and use it as a barber's razor on your head and beard, then take scales for weighing and divide the hair. So now Ezekiel is told to shave his head hair and his beard with a sword, and it symbolizes the defilement and the humiliation that Jerusalem is about to go through. They've got this sense of pride and arrogance, and God's about to knock them down a peg or two, and him shaving his hair and beard is a ritualistic no-no. It's frowned upon, and so it's humiliating, and God's going to make him do it for this. As a matter of fact, Deuteronomy forbids the shaving of your hair for a man. And so God is saying, now I want you to go against everything you've ever heard, and I want you to do this because it's going to humiliate you and it's going to be a source of defilement. And I want people to know what it's going to be like. Then look what he says. Take a scale and weigh your hair. I think, well, that's kind of odd. But he's going to weigh it in 3 different piles. Look at verse 2. 1/3 you'll burn in the fire. So shave off all his hair, beard, and head, and then take a scale and equally measure it in 3 different equal piles. They all weigh the same. So he's weighing his hair. He said that first pile, that first third, burn it in the fire. Just burn the hair up. Throw it in there and burn the thing. The second, look at verse 2. Well, let me go back and read this in this. 1/3 you shall burn in the fire at the center of the city when the days of the siege are complete. Then you shall take 1/3, strike it with the sword around the city, and 1/3 you'll scatter to the wind, and I will unsheath the sword behind them. So he says 1/3 you burn in the city of the what was the model of Jerusalem. Go into that model that you destroyed, burn 1/3 of your hair in the center of that model. The 1/3, he says, take outside the model 1/3 of your hair, chop it up with a sword. So they're all watching him do it. He's not saying anything. He's watching them. They're watching him do this, and he shaves his head and his beard, and they're like, well, you know, he's really lost it now, you know, after not eating for 430 days. And then he takes that hair and he throws some of it in the fire and it's just consumed. Then he takes another 1/3, takes it outside this little model, takes the sword, chops up his hair, and then he takes the other 1/3 pile, throws it up in the wind, lets the wind take it away. And then God said, that's what I'm going to do to them. I'm going to send a sword behind them. It's a pantomime. It's this acting out that God is showing what he's going to do with the people left in Jerusalem. What's he going to do to them? Number one, he's going to, he's saying that when the Babylonians come in, remember, a third of his hair he threw in the fire. A third of the people in Jerusalem will die by fire in the Babylonian invasion. They're not going to survive. A third of all those people that are in that city are going to die by fire. Then he says, the second part, the second third, he said, outside, remember he said, do this inside the city, in the center of that city model. Those people are going to die in that city, in that invasion. Then the second set of hair he took outside the city, the model city, and he chopped it up with a sword. That's God's way of saying a third of the people in Babylon or in Jerusalem will be killed by the Babylonian soldiers outside the city. A third of them are going to die inside the city. A third of them are going to die right outside the city. And then what's he do with the other third of his hair? He threw it up to the wind and it scattered. He said a third of the people, the only third that remains, that survives, is going to be scattered all over. They're going into captivity. They're going to be taken away. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they're going to be taken into captivity. So a third of them are going to die in the city. A third of them are going to die outside the city. And a third of them are going to be carried away. And Ezekiel is doing all this through a model of cutting his hair off and throwing it in the fire and chopping it with a sword. Now look at verse 3. And this is the great part for us. This is God's grace. Take also a few in number from them and bind them in the edges of your robes. Take again some of them and throw them into the fire and burn them in the fire. From it a fire will spread to all the house of Israel. So he's got that third that survived that's going into captivity. But he says to Ezekiel, he says, take a handful of that and hide it inside your robe. That signifies that there will be a remnant. There will be some left. And then some of them are going to go into the fire, that remnant. God said, those I'm going to judge. But there's going to be a remnant. God always has a remnant. God always has those who are left here, who are here, that still call upon his name, that still believe in him. There's a remnant. You and I are a remnant. We're the ones that are still here that are believers. God has us here for a purpose. We're not here just to take up space. We're not here just to occupy each other's time. We're here for a purpose. What's our purpose? Matthew chapter 28, to evangelize the world. That's our purpose. That's why we're here. We are called to share the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ and what he did for us. That's why we're here. If we're not going to do that, God might as well pull us out. We're not being effective here. But God has a plan for us. Now, it seems like, from reading all this, and here's the part that ties into us too, all these things that Ezekiel did were done in the presence of his neighbors. People watching. People seeing it. They're checking it out. And then you can read, I would encourage you to read the last part of chapter 5, because the last part of chapter 5 is basically just God's interpretation of these acts, basically what I just told you. And it's God's justification. And he explains that Jerusalem is in the center of all this judgment. It's in the center of God's plan. But that's the explanation in the last part of chapter 5. But you see that Ezekiel had a pretty strange ministry. I mean, here's a guy that was called by looking at these cherubim and wheels. And then God said, okay, for your first act of ministry, build this model and destroy it. And then for your second act of ministry, you're going to lay on your side for 430 days. And then for your third act of ministry, you're going to cook bread over human excrement and show the people how bad they're going to suffer when the Babylonians come in. And you read that and you got to kind of feel sorry for the guy. I mean, he's just trying to do what God's asked him to do, but God's asking him to do some really strange things. Now, here's the point that I always make, and I'm going to say this in closing. God never, well, I shouldn't say, you should never say never or always. God seldom asks you to do the easy, make sense stuff. Very, very rarely does God give you a calling in your life and you say to him, God, that makes perfect sense to me. Most of the time, God calls us to do those things that seem strange and unusual, that don't make sense. I'm counting my money, and it looks like my money is not going to last me till the end of the month. And God says, I want you to tithe, give me 10% of that. And we think, God, that doesn't make sense. That's not right. I can't afford to do that. But God's asking us to do something that don't make sense. He's asking us to do something that steps out of the realm of sense and into the realm of faith. That person that I can't stand, that did me wrong, that hurt my feelings, that really insulted my integrity. God said, I want you to love them and forgive them. And I'm like, that don't make sense to me. The thing that does make sense is for me to hold a grudge against them. That's the thing that makes sense. And God says, I don't want you to do that because I'm calling you to do those things that seem strange and unusual to you. Very rarely are we going to be asked to do the things that just make absolute sense. It's usually those things that don't, that God's calling us to do. And that's what Ezekiel ran into. Any questions about this? Well, all right. Well, before I sign off on our live feed, we will not have church next Wednesday night. It's the Wednesday. Can y'all believe it's the Wednesday before Christmas? Next Wednesday. That's right, isn't it? What's next week? Okay, 6. We will have it next week. We won't have it the next week, and we won't have it the 30th, unless we've got several people now that have contracted COVID in our church. So far, thank God's blessing on us. None of them have been here to expose us. They've not been here after they've contracted it. We're going to have to watch this real careful next week. Y'all pray for this, because if other people start coming down with it, we're going to have to reevaluate and close for a while, just to give everybody time to get over what they're dealing with. Hopefully that's not going to happen, but just, if you're watching us on Facebook, please pay attention to our announcement. If you're here, pay attention to our announcement, because we're going to do this the best we can. I don't want to have to close anything, but I don't want to expose somebody to get sick. So we're going to just kind of play it by ear and see how it goes. But just kind of watch. We'll try to meet next Wednesday if we can, and then we will not be meeting on the 23rd or 30th anyway. So just pray about that. We'll do the best we can. All right, we're gonna sign off. You guys, thanks for being with us, and hopefully we'll see you next Wednesday night. All right.